if you just click on the, do you see the message in the chat?
No, I think it only shows it. It doesn't show it to people who joined after you did.
Got it. Okay. Yeah, so just click on that link.
Sweet.
And that link will just take you to the board, and we'll take 5 minutes to fill this out after we had a chance to go over everything. And again, the point is just with 10 people on the call, instead of everyone asking questions, we can actually get the questions down and vote on them, and that way the most important things get discussed. Cool. So Alex, if you want to start with an intro, just quickly what you're working on, your knowledge of Truebit, where you'd be looking to get involved, kind of thing.
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. Is the mic working?
Yeah.
Hey, so I've been involved with Solidity and Ethereum for quite a while, and at some point started to work on EWASM. I think I was around the time Truebit switched to WebAssembly, and tried to follow Truebit ever since. But I think where there could be some real cooperation is some parts of what we do with WebAssembly at the EWASM project versus what Truebit is doing with WebAssembly. And also that includes a couple of things in Solidity itself. For example, having a WebAssembly output from Solidity. Yeah, I think that's like the quickest intro.
Thanks, Alex. Arseny, you're up.
Hey, everyone. So I've been interested in Solidity for over a year now. Right after graduating, I kind of started digging into tutorials, and I started contributing to open source projects. So I'm most interested in Solidity smart contract development, specifically very kind of novel and infrastructure level contracts like Truebit. So where I'd like to get involved is at the smart contract level.
Sweet.
Barath, you want to go next?
Yep. Hi. So I'm Bart. I've been kind of working the last few years kind of mostly over in the deep learning space, but the last year or so I got really interested in kind of blockchain and the Ethereum community broadly, and Truebit really struck me as interesting because I think it's one of the few projects really thinking about how to scale on Ethereum seriously. So I've kind of poked around in the repos, submitted a couple of small bug fixes, and looking to see if there are places where I can, help you guys kind of figure out and expand the project. So looking forward to kind of working with everyone here.
Dan, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. So Dan, I'm a software engineer Chain, which is a permission blockchain company, and I work mostly on virtual machine design and language design and implementation there. And I've sort of been interested in sort of smart contract language and VM design problem for a while, and I'm generally so I'm particularly interested in looking at and sort of I'm relatively new to the code base in the projects, but really interested in looking at the WASM implementation, both the OCaml off-chain one and the Solidity EVM one. So yeah, so just trying to learn because I learn more about those and about how they can be potentially sort of adapted or some sort of take some transference of knowledge from what's going on with EWASM and potentially having a WASM interpreter on chain.
Thanks, Dan. Harley, you want to go next?
Sure. Hey guys, I'm Harley. I'm one of the core developers on Truebit. I'm sort of leading the side on the GitHub side of like making sure everything on our repos is like kind of user friendly and developer friendly. And so I will be giving the overview shortly after everyone kind of gives their intros on what's going on.
Sammy, and then Sina, and then we can get started.
Hi, I'm Sami. I work on the Occam interpreter and also the Solidity one.
Hey everyone, I'm Sina. I'm also an engineer at Truebit. I work on designing the protocols, writing the smart contracts, and most recently on the WASM stuff.
Awesome. So Harley, maybe a place to start would be screen sharing and going through the GitHub repos, giving a quick overview. Maybe we'll spend, I don't know, 20, 30 minutes, and then we'll do another 20, 30 minutes of questions using the Trello board. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that seems good to me. Maybe just kind of watch the time for me or tell me if I'm taking too long. Get to see Sina's beautiful face.
Who is that guy? Very good looking.
That guy. Okay, so as of yesterday, I actually started this effort of revamping some of the documentation. And so the idea is that you'll see this repo called Developer Resources, and the idea is for this to be like the kind of the one-stop shop for like any of your info, or at least like will point you in the right direction of where else you need to go. And so like one of the things I just added was this whole page on getting started, and I think it's a pretty good overview of like where our code base is and like what kind of needs to get worked on. So if you're someone who's like interested in using Truebit, because we get a lot of people who like want to run verification games and stuff like that. We are in pretty early stages of development, but we do have like some kind of prototypes working. So if you're just want to mess around with stuff, and if you want to like sort of see like an end-to-end verification game, we just kind of really pushed to Rikubi, our script checker whole system, so you can see this repo. And this is for the Doge Ethereum bridge, and so we sort of have like a ton of content on that. And I think that's a good place to start if you want to see like kind of what a working version is. Sammy also has a tutorial for the WebAssembly stuff, and I'll kind of go into like what the differences between those are in a little bit when we get to the computation layer. So yeah, so now we're actually get to the part where we're like working on the code. So the idea is that like issues are going to be centric. Like if it's a problem and there's not an issue, then it's not a problem. It's kind of like the old adage of if a tree fell in the woods and no one heard it, did it actually happen? And then so that way we can sort of like use these issues as like our starting point and kind of like action items. So like if you ever like, I don't know where to start, just go and look at like issues and then see which one speaks to you the most. So it's pretty basic like open source ideas. I think that one thing we should highlight is that so Truebit is sort of broken up into like 3 pieces. Let's just go to this one. I have these little diagrams kind of laying around on different repos to sort of give you a landmark to see like where that repo belongs in our like overall architecture. So we'll start with the incentive layer, and that's the like topmost piece. And so you can sort of like have these different pieces act independently of them. And the idea is that well, eventually one Truebit system will be the combination of all these 3 pieces. But we sort of are working on these pieces independently or like kind of in parallel. And so this repo is the incentive layer. And it's basically just like an implementation of the spec in the white paper. So I assume everyone's read the white paper here, but just like pretty much basic jackpot backing where verifiers are incentivized to verify by, winning some jackpot. And that has like pretty basic Solidity problems. So if for the Solidity developers, this has been, where people have been going. I know Arseni's working on this issue with using TypeScript for our tests, for our truffle tests. So that would be cool. So stuff like that. Yeah, so if you're into Solidity and like want to do smart contract stuff, this is a good place to go. So the next spot is the dispute resolution layer, which I've been working on recently. And here we go. And this is supposed to be sort of like a, so yeah, I also have this diagram. So you see it's the middle spot. So yeah, it's supposed to be able to plug into like different types of incentive layers. So, you know, the jackpot idea is like something that we've been working on, but like it has limitations. So maybe in the future we'll want to upgrade or do a different thing. And so the idea is that we'll have these different layers, this sort of like interface to them. And the dispute resolution layer is basically just like the verification game and just sort of condensed down to its most basic pieces. And then different computation layers will sort of get plugged in. And I guess I'll give a second to sort of talk about the difference between, you know, the Doge Bridge stuff we worked on or iScript Interactive and like the general WASM stuff. So the general, like the WebAssembly interpreter is like the holy grail, because then we can sort of do like a whole Turing machine like list of tasks. There's really no limit to what kind of tasks we can do. But our Doge Ethereum bridge uses what's called, what we sort of call it a Truebit Lite architecture, where it only implements, you know, kind of one function. And so it implements script. And it's kind of an interesting idea. I think that, you know, these Truebit Lite mechanisms might be really useful for like maybe machines that have like hardware constraints. And so I've actually been working on the world's simplest verification game, or trying to, and it's called the Simple Adder. And the idea is that there's just, you know, you just sum up some number and then people will play a verification game on whether or not you like agreed or not. And I've been working on that to sort of just illustrate how the different pieces of the verification game works. But there's also a nice, juicy, simple hasher VM that we could make that you could actually do verifiable Merkle roots and doing a Truebit game. So that could be useful for like compressing data and stuff. Anyways, I digress. But this is also another area of Solidity smart contracts that also is sort of like branching, or you know what, let me go back to what I had, the getting started page. Yep. Okay. So yeah, there's kind of this spectrum between on-chain and off-chain. And so like incentive layer lives on-chain, dispute resolution layer, it lives like sort of, you know, in between on-chain and off-chain. And so if you're kind of, if that's where you're interested, like, you know, you should definitely check this out. And if you're like interested in how verification games work, or how like, you know, interactive proofs work in general, this is like a good example. This sort of like also leads us to where WebAssembly Solidity. And so the idea is that hopefully one day our whole dispute resolution layer can be like kind of this general interface to plug in these different computation plugins. And so one of them could be this WebAssembly one. And this is the thing that Sammy's been working on, and is actually a WebAssembly interpreter written in Solidity, which is like super crazy. And it's running the one single step on chain. And so there's like a ton of cool stuff to work on with that, which then leads us to, you know, the final piece, which is the computation layer, and that's where the WebAssembly interpreter lives. And so you can see all the relevant repos there. So we have the OCaml off-chain, but there's also this necessary mscriptin module wrapper that you need to use to wrap up your Solidity code, or to wrap up the WebAssembly code to be ready for the VM. And also it has, yeah, some interesting documentation there. So that, oh yeah, and then if you want to work on the protocol stuff, we have a lot of cool stuff, and you can go hang out with Sina. So that is an overview. I kind of ran through it quickly, but oh yeah, also we've also have a lot of issues where we've realized that, like, you know, other teams are probably having these issues.
Where did it come from?
Hey Jason. And then so like I mentioned, Arseny is working on the TypeScript tests, and like apparently that was more of a rabbit hole than we kind of imagined. And I saw that Arseny is like working on kind of a open source, or like a repo where it's like a template for TypeScript Solidity stuff. So that is really cool. There's also like a ton of stuff where like Rust WebAssembly, like that's a new thing, or we're looking into Rust, or just general WebAssembly stuff. And then I guess the last piece I should talk about is that, especially with the smart contract code side of things, we have to develop clients. So like there has to be agents that interact with these smart contracts. And so here you'll see like these client repos. And there's actually some interesting research problems that need to be solved there. So like there needs to be caching. So if your client gets shut down and then like you need to be able to instantaneously get back online. And then there's also issues about like your user interface can get really messed up if there's a block reorganization. So those are just two examples of like research problems that like other teams will be facing. And then we've like thought about that and like want to start pushing, you know, kind of more open source development for that. And, you know, our Truebit Foundation repos can be a home for these projects, you know, if that needs to be the case. But overall, yeah, so if it's not an issue, is it actually a problem? We have like over 80 issues I've counted on all of our different repos. So there's a ton of stuff to get started. And another thing is that we've definitely need more documentation. And so making issues and kind of stuff around that is a big push. Yep, so that is, I think that's about 20 minutes, so.
Awesome. Thanks for that intro, Harley. So now what I want to do is if everyone can switch over to this Trello screen, and we're going to just spend 3 minutes adding cards. And this is just going to be used to rank what people want to chat and learn about. And so if you just click on the left side here and you can add, you know, a card in the top, you just, you know, enter, add something that, you know, any questions that you have. And we'll go from there. So we're just going to leave now 3 minutes for everybody to kind of look through this and add cards they want to discuss, and then we'll vote on these cards. Does anyone have any questions on that?
I missed out.
So we're just going to do 1 more minute. I'm not seeing many people adding a lot of questions. Is that because there isn't any? And if there's not, then we can just have Sina and Harley talk through potential issues and assigning them. Okay, great. We'll leave it at that. Harley, do you want to start with number 1 here? Instead of voting, I think we have time to talk through all of these. If perhaps you can talk a bit about the documentation, where there's low-hanging fruit, and where people can start contributing.
Yeah. Okay.
Before we get into these, does anyone have any of the open source people have any questions on any of these items or anything that's not covered or anything Harley covered so far? Okay, awesome.
Sweet. Yeah, so should I do a screen share again? Is that?
Sure. If you're gonna go over some stuff on the repo, then yeah.
Yeah, well, I'll just be like clicking around. So, and I'm a more visual person anyway, so that will probably be better. Yeah. So, like I said, issues are the like starting point of all contributions. So, developer resources is sort of like where hopefully all the documentation will live, and sort of like links to like any relevant resources. So, like, for one thing, I just put links for like Truebit, all the like Truebit videos I could find on YouTube, and stuff like that. Or if like you notice that like our Twitter is like not linked, like I noticed that wasn't on this repo. So there definitely needs to be like more high level things. And so like let me show you like here, this table of contents is looking rather lacking right now. So that's a good example. And so I actually have issues for that. So like we should have an overview on the computation layer, which we sort of already do, but it would be helpful if it kind of lived over here. Dispute resolution overview, I guess I kind of already finished that one. You know, so like I said, issues are the starting point. So like low hanging fruit for documentation, I added some of these, like this one, I was just being lazy and I didn't want to do it. So I just made it as an issue, stuff like that. Definitely very easy to do. There are like a lot of sort of like interesting interacting kind of pieces within Truebit. So I think one thing that we could probably definitely use a lot of work with is like the different WebAssembly stuff. And it seems that a lot of the people on this call are interested in WebAssembly. And I think, you know, documentation around like how it actually works and stuff like that, or like pointers, that could probably be a good thing to add. I should probably add issues for that. I don't know. I think it should be pretty obvious where the low-hanging fruit is for the documentation at this point. Unless anyone has questions on that, I'm very happy to answer some of those.
Perhaps we can move on and start with for people who are interested in getting involved on the Solidity side, where they can get involved as a starting point, and for people who are interested in getting involved on the WebAssembly side, where they can start out, and we can kind of go from there.
Okay, yeah, totally. So I would say the Solidity side of things, depending on where you want to go, incentive layer and dispute resolution layer, very safe places to be. And then when you want to start going into the WebAssembly stuff, that is a little bit, so there's different repos for that. So if you want to do the WebAssembly Solidity stuff, that, you know, there's a repo for that. And if you want to work on the sort of WebAssembly different pieces, then like I said, you should definitely go back to our developer resources, go to getting started, and that has links to where you should go. So if you're like on more off-chain kind of stuff, so these repos are where you want to start looking at, and getting those to run. Does that answer that question, I guess?
Are people generally following the structure of the repos and where everything is, so make sure we're all on the same page? Harley, you want to turn off your screen share? So yeah, I guess Dan and Alex, for instance, you guys were interested in the VM and the WASM stuff. Does the layout of those repos and where everything is and how to get started kind of make sense as a first step?
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned there was some documentation about that. That wasn't.
Yeah. So that is, I would definitely check. Sammy has some good wikis there, and I know he has more of them. So so you can go on those different repos and check their wikis. WebAssembly Solidity, I think that one had there you go. So that one has a bunch of stuff.
I see. Yeah.
Yep. So yeah, like I should probably have a better link for that, the developer resources. That's something I can add.
I shared the link to that GitHub in the messages of the chat. You can just look at the wikis and the WebAssembly Solidity repo are good.
So the high level of what's happening on the WebAssembly side is, yeah, so there's the on-chain WebAssembly, which is in the WASM Solidity repo, which is a simple interpreter, just runs one step. And then there's the off-chain stuff, which is currently an OCaml off-chain and an mscripton module wrapper. So mscripton module wrapper you use so if you use mscripton as it is, you can compile C and C++ to WASM, but you also get this JavaScript, runtime environment. And mscripton module wrapper kind of puts them together into a single WASM file that you can use. So that's kind of more on the generation front. And then the OCaml off-chain repo is our off-chain interpreter. So the three real things we needed to, and Sammy can talk more to this because he's basically built all of this so far, so we took the vanilla OCaml WASM interpreter, which is actually the spec implementation, the reference implementation, and we need to make three changes. One is we need to add gas metering, right? So you charge per instruction that's run. And there's a lot of interesting kind of optimizations and improvements here that spending some time with Alex, we learned about, doing it per block of code or branches of code. And do you do it at deploy time, at runtime, all these kind of considerations. So there's gas metering. Then the other thing is making all of the code fully deterministic, because you're running it inside of this distributed environment where the nodes need to. So in a normal blockchain, the nodes need to agree on the final result to come to consensus. But in Truebit, it's actually even more strict than that. The nodes need to agree on every step of the process all the way through, because otherwise, there will be a dispute. So this involves turning off, floating point operations, limiting the depth of the stack, things that could really be different on different hardware architectures. And the final thing that is, so these two buckets, metering and indeterminism, are shared between Truebit and eWASM, Parity WASM, basically anyone who's using WebAssembly and blockchains. And then we have a third requirement for Truebit, which is the ability to take snapshots of the state. So to create a Merkle tree of the state, the memory, the stack, all this stuff, and create a Merkle root, which is used inside of the verification game. The solver kind of commits to that. Those are the three big pieces. And we have a prototype that works, but I think there's a lot of optimizations and improvements to be done. And Sammy's wikis on both the OCaml, the mscripton, and the WebAssembly Solidity repo are like really good places to start for that.
Can I have a question?
Yeah.
So I think it was like probably actually it was after DEF CON when I looked at the OCaml source code, trying to find an actual spec for the steps, how you build the steps. But I remember even way before that what Christian explained, but I wonder if there's an actual documentation for that. I mean, it can be extracted from the WebAssembly Solidity code as well, and the OCaml code. But if there would be a documentation, that would be nicer.
Around what exactly? I just missed. Around how the state is created, or the
which parts of the state you take, in what format you take it, and how you get the hash out of it.
Totally. I'll just make a note of this, and I'll make an issue around documenting this.
The reason I asked it, because for a brief second a week ago, I was thinking about maybe implementing it in binary and or Webbit, but there's no point trying to do it before having a proper spec for it.
Totally. And so are there, if there's no questions on this side, maybe we can do the same thing for the non-WebAssembly parts of the code. It's like Arseny, Bharat, Alex, Dan, do you guys have any questions when it comes to that stuff?
So before we jump in on the Solidity stuff, Arseny and Barath, you guys have both went through the repos. I've seen you, Barath, with some pull requests. Do you have any comments? Are there specific things we could do to make things easier to understand? Are there like questions you have after looking through things?
So I guess on my end, I was a little confused before, like what all the different repos were and how they fit together. But I think that kind of the developer resources that you showed today, I think that'll help a lot. So I think keeping that updated, just kind of with how the global structure of the project fits together, I think will just really help. So I'm going to go through and check out some of that material later. Besides that, I think great simple use cases. So like highlighting that more, having kind of like really basic, like here's how dummies get started and run a little Truebit game type thing, just to like, because I'd love to try, setting up a little game where I do like the matrix multiply example in the Truebit paper. So I'd love to see if I can, toss together some code to do an actual matrix multiply. That might be tricky, but that type of like, just how do I get started and do something really simple and run the full system, and like a little walkthrough, I think would help a lot.
Yeah, I agree with what Bharat said. Having that a complete end-to-end example of how the system works kind of helps understand each individual piece as well.
So that seems like kind of a good task for, I mean, it will involve a bunch of pain for whoever is making that first example, but it also sounds like a really good good project for getting onboarded and documenting the whole process. So is that like something you guys would feel up to? Or maybe it's like too much of it's too big of a project potentially because the code base is at an early stage.
I think personally, I don't think I feel like I understand the code base well enough to volunteer for that task. I am going to poke around in a little bit, and if I spot any like low-hanging fruit that I can do, I'll send some more pull requests your way.
So here, the question in another way, so far since you've been poking around in the code base, is there anything that has been a blocker? Or like you mentioned, having the developer resources repo more clear, but is there anything else that you in trying to run this has, led to questions?
I don't think I would say anything's a blocker. I think, so I've read the white paper carefully, and then like part of the exercise I try to do in my head is like try to match the white paper against the code base. And I think maybe just like a little like either graphic or little tutorial section kind of saying, oh, hey, remember section 4 of the white paper, here's like the contracts associated with that. Like just a little roadmap type thing. That might be useful as well. Beyond that, no, I don't think there's any like fundamental blockers.
Yeah, just from my side, I've been mainly looking at the incentive layer repo, and like Harley mentioned earlier, taking on the setting up TypeScript tests, which I think would be super helpful. That's a big task in of itself, and I've been working with the 0x team. They've developed a lot of tools for doing TypeScript development with Web3, and they've been helping me kind of get that repo off the ground. And after that, I'll look deeper into the Solidity-related incentive layer issues.
Awesome. In the remainder of time, perhaps there's a couple of things I'd like to cover. Perhaps, Harley, you can go over where, if you had to say the 5 most important issues or a few important issues where people can get involved, we can cover that. And then maybe we can, since Alex is on the line, have a quick discussion of how metering might work and what metering EWASM has worked on that could be available for us. I think those are 2 important points to cover. So let's do that.
Yeah, so I definitely like agree with the idea of like people wanting to be able to run sort of like a step-by-step guide. And I think, you know, one thing with that is that we don't really have like client software. So I think like getting some of these clients off the ground, which is pretty much just like basic Web3 sort of interacting with smart contract stuff, but it has to do with like the Truebit sort of, you know, business logic, so to speak, to use a really great buzzword. Let me like incentive layer. Yeah, I mean, incentive layer is like really close to being done. And so if we could get like the client going and then where there's like a CLI type thing, I think I have some issues for that. And we can even, and then, you know, we can even like put a dummy just for the dispute resolution layer so people can like start testing the assumptions of the incentive layer and stuff like that. So I think getting some of those clients off the ground would definitely help with the narrative around people like actually using the code and like getting it started and running it. That's all I got. What were the other parts?
Yeah, I think, well, you know, that's really helpful. Based on sort of some of these issues that we've discussed, you know, I think Arseny, you are the most likely to be contributing. Anything jumping out at you outside of the TypeScript stuff?
I was taking a look at one of the issues that it said to create the task manager contract to move the generic task manager functionality. I remember when I first looked at the repo, I kind of was poking at that, and it seemed like most of what the existing contract does is handle the tasks. So I was wondering maybe if we could get some clarification on that.
Oh yeah, yeah, that's a good point. We've fluctuated between like task book and stuff like that. What I was thinking there was that there would be a like task manager contract that sort of like is just all it does is sort of like create a task and like delete a task and just sort of like controls those types of things. And then the rest of it, the incentive layer would sort of just be the composition of all of those. Because most of the yeah, so like here we're like, yeah, so here we're creating a task and we're just like incrementing values. And we can like, the task can be done, but like that, a lot of that logic it's pretty generic. And doesn't really have, let's say like something with like the jackpot over here. So like, yeah, like rewarding, it has like nothing to do with jackpot. So the idea is that the incentive layer would be the composition of the jackpot manager, deposits manager, and like a task manager. And then just sort of like the sort of high level logic necessary just on top of those three pieces. Just to kind of make the abstraction a little bit more clear. But that was the idea. I probably should add some more comments in that issue. But we actually have a contributor, Sam Molias, who's on this call. He's supposed to be working on that, so we'll see what progress he made. That.
So I have a question on the WASM side for Alex and Dan, like what your thoughts are. So I've been looking more into eWASM, parity WASM, and it seems like we could maybe build off of the same infrastructure because we have, you know, non-indeterminism and metering as shared concerns. The one thing that kind of makes a difference is we need to be able to take snapshots of state. And, you know, there's parts of the state that aren't open to the outside world in the standard WASM VM. You know, the stack is implicit. If you do any JIT, how does that impact where you can really snapshot the state? And that's something that Sammy and I are thinking about right now. So it's more of an architectural type of a discussion. But if you guys have any thoughts or want to think through that with us in the future or now, that would be helpful.
Yeah, so I mean, so JIT's going to be a problem for EWASM too, right? I mean, I assume they must. I mean, they must sort of be working on some canonical, because like they have to but I guess maybe not, because if they're metering at the beginning of if they just meter for the full amount, then there can be sort of like optimizations in the implementation. Is that the idea?
Well, we got the expert right here, so.
No. So the right. So I guess. And again, yeah, I've only sort of looked sort of at the high level architecture of the Ethereum thing. The idea is with metering that it injects the metering code at the beginning of each branch, right? Each block. So you could, right? So in EWASM, I see you could have an optimization of the code execution. How it actually gets executed in there, as long as it's the same amount, it doesn't matter, because it still gets, all that matters is that it gets metered at the beginning, whereas you need actually deterministically every step, right?
Yeah, so Alex, maybe you can talk to that, or how do you see the differences here?
Yeah, cheating is quite a hot topic at the moment in the WASM project. But yeah, I think then you were correct in pretty much everything. So the way we do metering is, it's not fully clear, but it can happen at deploy time. You could do it before execution. But in any case, we look at basic blocks, which don't have any branches, and we just sum up the cost of that given block, and we insert a statement before the block. And that statement will call the outside and deduct the necessary resources. And if there's not enough resources left, in our terms, we just call it gas. If there's not enough gas left, then it just traps. And in that sense, jitting doesn't really matter too much, because the cost would be deducted in a deterministic manner. But it would be quite easy to jit it, probably in a bad way, where, well, okay, maybe not quite easy, but the theory is that probably it is possible to craft a certain piece of code, which in a certain JIT would result in a much worse performance than the actual gas cost we have assigned to it. That's one of the issues which kind of are against JITs, because they cannot really charge anything else. In most of the regular cases, the assumption is that whatever the JIT process will do to the code would result in faster execution times, or in the worst case, the same as it would have been with an interpreted code. And the way we try to determine the actual gas costs at the moment is we are taking a couple of interpreters and say we have a goal of spending 10 million gas in 1 second. And we try to come up with a starting baseline gas cost based on all the interpreters out there. And that means if someone then uses a JIT, which would be faster, they get a benefit. Because physically they're spending less CPU time, but they get the same cost for it.
Right. I mean, I think usually there's at least I know in like the JavaScript VMs, there's fallback behavior where if it detects that it's that some patch of code is behaving slower than its optimized patch just falls back to doing the non-optimized one. But yeah, I could see how that could be a problem. But then for Truebit though, you need every individual step, because you can't have the challenge like end on a block, right? It has to be like you have to have it some very particular step in the middle there. So I see how. So for that, I guess you just can't really do JIT for that.
No, and actually back to what Sina you have mentioned, I think it may be a good idea to come up with a spec of an instrumentation spec for WASM. So other VMs could just support that spec and expose all these bits needed from the state.
Yeah, that sounds really interesting.
So a spec of what parts of the state we'd need instrumentation on, and then implementations of WASM could open that up if it's a shared need.
Yeah. Well, I would assume that you would have at least two different specs. One, probably like a C API to be shared by all the interpreters, JITs written in C, and another one for the browser. Because the JavaScript API to WASM is basically what defines the interaction with WASM from JavaScript, and you probably could have this instrumentation API exposed to the browser, well, to JavaScript in the browser the same way. Yeah, I'm not saying that this would be accepted anytime soon and implemented by other browsers, but having a spec for this definitely helps to get it started.
Totally. All right. Well, we can follow up offline about all that stuff off chain.
So if I can interject, I just have a quick question here. I've mostly been working around with the Solidity side of the project, but the EWASM stuff sounds really interesting. Good entry point to like get check that part of the project out and see what's going on, or what's a good way to get a toehold in.
So I can't speak to the Truebit one, although I've looked at the wiki here. So I just started looking at the wiki for WebASM Solidity GitHub repo. But there's also a pretty good wiki on the EWASM repo that's like Martin's EWASM design overview and specification. So it's github.com/EWASM/design, and that sort of has the design principles and some of these decisions around like things like metering for EWASM. So I think a lot of those probably carry over somewhat into the Truebit WASM.
Yeah, put in the two links into the chat for the design and the Gitter channel we have.
All right, awesome. Thanks. I'll go check these out offline or off chain, so to speak.
There's also a link in the chat that Sammy's put on the Inscription module. He's mentioned that's a pretty good starting point. And I just put another link from Dan Goman, one of the creators or on the steering committee of WASM. It's just a WASM reference manual. It's a little bit easier to understand than the WASM spec. So all of those are good places to get started. So for us, from the Truebit side, we want to thank everybody for joining. The goal here is just, as we're building to keep everything open and super transparent and get feedback from the community, we'll continue to adopt some of the changes recommended. So getting an example up and running, and then continuing to work with you guys via Slack over the next couple weeks. We will also work to drive attention to sort of what some of the most important issues are and reach out offline. Is there any other questions that anyone has about, further getting involved or the development or, kind of suggestions? Awesome.
Do you guys have a place, an instant messaging chat room or something open to the public?
So we do have a Slack, which has been invite only for or closed just to avoid any speculators, where it's just researchers and developers. But it is invite, and there's some friction there. So Harley is in the process of starting a developer chat. Harley, you want to discuss that?
Yeah, I think starting point, we've been looking around different messaging platforms, but I think probably the Jitter is a good place to start in terms of just development, because that way people can log in with their GitHubs and everything, and there's not a lot of friction there. Just to have a more general place where if you don't know where to go and need to talk to someone, and that way it's just easy.
Yeah, so question for you guys, because we were debating that for Dan and Brath and Arseny and Axic, Gitter or Discord preferred?
No real preference. I like Discord, but I would not. It doesn't matter to me.
Haven't used Discord much, but I run a Gitter chat room for DeepCam, which is a deep learning library that I run. It's been pretty active. We have 150 people on there. Lots of public developers answering issues. So I've had a pretty good experience with Gitter on my end.
Yeah, I think Gitter is a good way to go.
Yeah, I like Discord too, but I think the getter will be maybe a little bit more focused, and then we could always add a Discord later too. I mean, there's none of this is mutually exclusive, so yeah. I'm gonna that's gonna be one of my action items for this week, this coming week, is to set up the jitter. I'll be linking that in the Slack and everything.
To be honest, I prefer Slack over both, but I know. So, are you planning to kind of discontinue that and move everyone over?
No, it's just that like Slack has the paywall, and then also like we also have the invite only thing, and I think it's probably that's just the way it's been, and it's probably best to keep it that way just for the time being. Since like Slack has the paywall, like making it open doesn't really help, because then like you won't even be able to see stuff from like 2 hours ago. So yeah.
Okay, that makes sense.
That's kind of the thinking there. But definitely like a Discord would probably sort of substitute the Slack as like a more open alternative. Whereas we lost Robbie. Oh, there he is. But yeah, cool. I agree. I think we need a place for people to come and ask questions. So
Awesome, guys. Really appreciate you taking the time on a Friday to give us some advice on our repo. And we'll be making some of these changes in the next couple of weeks. We're moving towards a demo with LivePeer. Haven't set a date, but that's sort of the next step on the development roadmap, is something similar to Script Interactive, but more generalized using WebAssembly. So we will keep everybody posted via the development channel. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys. Great meeting you all.
Thank you.
Right.
Take care.
Bye-bye.